A whole tutorial filled with festive drawing. Grab those pencils and let's get started. Okay, so I have the line drawing down. The reference photograph for this tutorial is supplied by Mike Arney via Unsplash, and I've put a link to that in the description. I'm going to start with his hat, and then I'm going to move on to his face and his beard and his collar, and sort of move around to his coat and then onto his glove and his the letter that he's got. So that's the sort of order that I'm going to do the portrait, just so that means I can keep my hand away from areas that have already been worked on at any one time. That just sort of makes sense to me. So let me take my kneadable eraser, and I'm going to just dab out, almost sort of knocking back these lines so I can still see them a little bit, but only just. Let's take those back a bit. Before we continue, I've just got time to mention that if you're looking for more tutorials this festive season, you might like to join me over on Patreon. You'll find over 140 hours of pet portrait and animal theme tutorials that you can work through, and I add more every month. Okay, let's get back to Santa. So I'm coming in with a coal grey 3, and really gently bringing a bit of this colour into the edge of this hat. Really gently. I want this hat to be quite sort of soft and fuzzy. My pencil is it's sharpish, but it's not super duper sharp. You can see it's got quite a rounded tip on the end, and that's just quite nice for this because it means I've got a fairly thin line, but at the same time I have got a nice sort of even coverage and not harsh pencil lines sticking into the, or sort of digging into the Pastelmat. So I'm just coming down the side of this hat really gently. Every now and again where I can see there's a slightly darker bit, I'm going to put that in, so on this corner for instance. So what I'm looking for is, even though this is a white fur hat, you can see that there's not a lot of white in here. There's a lot of like this sort of coal grey colour. There's a lot of warm grey colours, and I should be going in with warm greys in a minute. And so what I want to do is I want to use these coal greys and these warm greys and almost sort of fill in the dark bits in between the white fur. So I'm looking for the shadows, I'm looking for the gaps, I'm looking for all that sort of negative space, if that's what you want to call it. And that is, so by drawing these darker bits, that's going to, you can see it's already sort of starting to take shape. That will create the lighter bits for me, and it will make it look like white fur. And this technique, even though we're doing this on Santa's hat, this is exactly the same technique that I would use if I was doing white fur on an animal. For instance, a dog that's got quite sort of long white fur like this. Obviously this fur is quite long, but it's the same technique. And I'm just bringing it over. Whilst I've got this pencil in my hand, I'm going to come round here as well. I'm going to come along the edge of this hat. I want the wispy bits to sort of go up into the hat. If I just grab a piece of scrap Pastelmat, when you put your pencil down on the paper or the Pastelmat, whatever you're drawing on, you will get quite a blunt end on the one side, and as you flick it, you get the wispy end on the other side. So you're always going to have the blunt end on one side and the wispy bit on the other side. So because I'm drawing sort of the dark bits going up into this fur, I want to make all of the sort of wispy bits go upwards. So you can see the wispy bits are going up, and that actually makes it look like we've got some nice white wispy fur there sort of sitting on top of this shadow. Don't ever want to press on harder. If I want it darker, if I want an area darker, so for instance here I want the area darker, I don't press on harder, because all I'm going to do is just flatten down the tooth of the Pastelmat, and then that means it's going to be quite hard for me to add more pencil at a later date. So what I want to do is I'll just keep going back over it, still with the light pressure. This is about the amount of pressure that I'm putting down. So if I want something darker, I keep the same amount of pressure and I will just go over it a couple of times. So that's all I'm doing here. So that's a basic sort of stroke. I sort of call that my first stroke, really, because I do a lot of animal portraits. I call that my basic first stroke. It's just that sort of wispy end on the one side and a blunter end where you put your pencil down on the other side. And so I'm just taking this up, and here perhaps come down a little bit as well, because it's obviously coming into his hair here. But I'm only just plotting this in. And I'm just looking to bring a little bit of shape around here. Nothing too much. Just a little bit of shape to just sort of show that lovely, almost like a roundness on the fur. And I'm building up already. I don't know if you can see that. If I hold that pencil against the paper, you can see I've got a slightly flat edge on one side, and I call that a chisel tip. And the flatter edge can sometimes give you, using the flatter edge on the paper, can sometimes give you a nice soft coverage, a nice soft sort of dusting of colour without putting harsh pencil lines down on the page. I want to come in with the warm grey now. So this is the warm grey 2, and I'm going to come back up this side again. I'm going to bring that over, blend it into that blue, or the coal grey that we've just put down, but it's quite a bluey sort of grey, isn't it? And I'm going to bring this down. Again, I'm using these little flicks out. On the edge, I want the flicks to come away. I want the flicks to end on the outside so that I get all these lovely wispy bits on the outside of this hat, and it's going to make it look quite sort of soft and fuzzy, and that's what we need. I don't have to make this texture exactly as it is in the photograph. That doesn't really matter. I'm just looking for some texture to make this hat look like it's a nice soft, really sort of deep, fluffy hat that you would imagine Santa would wear. I can go over the coal grey. I don't need to keep these colours separate from each other. Making one go over the other will give me another shade of grey, and that will work nicely as well. And then as I get to the bottom again, because I want the darker bits to almost sort of represent the shadows going up into the hat, again I'm just switching and I'm flicking up so that I get the lovely wispy bits up into the hat. And I'm holding my pencil, you can see I'm holding my pencil quite far back. I don't want to hold it upright as if I was writing, because I just will get, well, I'll put too much pressure down and it will just get too tight. I want it to be much sort of looser. And I'm just curving, you can see I'm just sort of curving these strokes around in the middle, because I want that sort of, that roundness to make it look like it's a really thick, fluffy hat. And this might look like it's getting quite dark on this side, but what I'll do is I should be putting some highlights in a little while. So I've got a little bit of a base in there already. I'm going to come in with a clean dry paintbrush, and I just really, really gently want to pull some of this colour together, soften it out on the edges. I can bring the brush out this way to just soften this. I want it to look really, really soft. Bring this together a little bit. It doesn't really matter whether I use circular motions or, you know, the directional strokes that we've been doing with the pencil. Anything that's just going to soften this down a little bit. The one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to scrub really hard, because I'll just push it into, I'll push the pencil into the tooth of the Pastelmat. And I don't want to do that too much. I want to move what's on the surface around to blend it. I don't just want to sort of scrub it in. And anyway, if I scrub too hard with the paintbrush, I'll also just sort of scrub some of it away. I'll have to start again. So I want to keep the pressure light. And I can use some of the spare, almost like the spare pencil dust that I can move around to actually just colour some of the lighter areas as well, colour some of these white areas that I've got, this raw paper. So that's just blended the colours together a little bit and just sort of softened it down. I'm going to go back in with a cold grey 4, and where I can see these darker bits, so I'm looking for the bits that would be sort of deep up into this fur, I'm going to really gently, pressing on lightly again, but I'm going to pick out a couple of these darker bits. So the bits that would be quite sort of deep up into these little tufts. Pressing on light. It's much better for me to build up the sort of darkness that I want, or the intensity that I want, with several lighter layers than it is with one heavy dark layer, because I just won't get the softness if I build it up too quickly. I want to keep this softness. Holding my pencil quite far back again. Don't want to hold my pencil too close to the edge. I want to keep this really nice and subtle. And I'm just sort of using little dashes here. There's a couple of extra little bits of detail at the top of this reference photograph, which I quite like, so I want to just sort of pop that in. And then I'm just looking for some of the dark bits on the bottom. I'm not going to go all the way along just yet. I'm going to... Oh, actually, I might as well. I will go all the way along. Might as well just put a few darker bits in there. And I'm just keeping this quite random. I'm not really looking... I'm sort of roughly looking at the photograph, but I'm not following this to the letter. I want to go in with a warm grey 4 as well. So this is a warm grey this time. And then I'm going to bring in a little bit of this warmer grey into this area as well, into these darker bits. Just here and there. It's all quite soft. I'm not too worried about this line at the bottom of the hat, because as we come onto his face and his hair, we will refine this. So I'm just sort of plotting it in, really. I'm not that worried about getting that perfect at this minute. So the hat, I've got some texture into it. I'm going to just take my kneadable eraser, and where I can see that there were slightly lighter parts, I'm just going to drag my kneadable eraser over these lighter parts, pull out a few highlights, and this creates nice sort of soft highlights, which works well with that those darker colours that we've just put in. Adds to that sort of fluffy texture. Just sort of blending it and pulling it through a little bit. If you have a paper stump and it's got to have a clean edge on it, you can also use your paper stump to very gently soften this fur. I'm going to use the paper stump because this one's quite a large one. They come in packs. I'll put a link to them in the description, but they're not particularly expensive. They come in, well, this came in, I don't know if it was a pack of 12 or a pack of 24, but quite a large pack, all different sizes, and they're really quite useful. I use them quite a lot. So again, we're just sort of softening out that fur, and because we want this to be all nice and soft, it's just helping create that softness. And then I'm just tidying it up here and there again with a couple of these little highlights with the the kneadable eraser, just pulling those through. And then I'm going to take the warm grey one, and after I've blended with the paper stump, I'm just going to smooth out some of this grain with a warm grey one. I'm just covering that up to protect it a little bit. And again, I'm just smoothing out, so bringing it all together with this warm grey one. I'm not pressing on hard, just bringing this together. And I don't necessarily need to go over all of I'm not looking to sort of fill all of this area in with colour, because this is all quite sort of fluffy and soft. I don't mind if I can actually see the grain. Sometimes the grain works in your favour, as we're going to see when we come down later on in the portrait. The grain actually works for us rather than against us, i.e. the graininess. So I don't want to necessarily get rid of all of this grain. I just want to blend little bits. I'm happy to still have raw paper in this area. We can still add more to this afterwards. This doesn't, this isn't necessarily finished. It's just getting this lovely soft texture in. In this area over here, I want to just bring in a tiny little bit of a purple blue sort of colour. I'm going in with Delft blue, really lightly, just to bring in an extra little bit of interest into this fur. And I can see a little bit of sort of purple blue on the reference photograph, so really lightly. And then at the same time, I'm also going to come down here with a little bit of the dark indigo. Again, the Polychromos. Put a little bit of the dark indigo in here as well. And if you didn't have these colours, obviously just go with any sort of dark blue that you've got. The nice thing about Santa is we can put any colours we want into him, really. This is the dark indigo. So it's the dark indigo and the Delft blue that I'm using to do this, but this is the dark indigo I'm using at the minute, and just putting tiny little bits of extra interest into this hat. And I'm just going to blend it, and you can either blend it with the paper stump or you could blend it with the paintbrush, whatever you've got. It's just something to soften down what's there. So I'm just blending that with a little bit of the warm grey 3, blending that colour into the rest of the hat, and then just bringing a little bit of highlighting again with the kneadable eraser. And as I drag off the highlights with the kneadable eraser, you can see I'm sort of leaving some of that colour on underneath, and that's good. That's what I want, because this whole hat has got to look like it's got quite a deep sort of texture to it. So leaving those bits of colour underneath means that I'm building up this sort of illusion that this hat's got really sort of deep fur. Now that I've put those highlights in, I'm just going to blend this a little bit, blend these lighter areas with a white Pablo. And I'm using the white Pablo because it's a lovely, thick, creamy, quite opaque colour. And I find it's really useful for, first of all, for blending on Pastelmat, or for just putting sort of top layers and details on. They're really quite useful pencils. Just using the manual pen cutter, and I'm just using it as I would a pen really to draw. I'm just using it to bring a couple of little bits of hair going in different directions, just to almost add another layer to make it look fuller again. So I'm just using this to create little bits of hair going in different directions, and just smooth those out a little bit with this white Pablo as well, just sort of smoothing them out so that I make them sort of sit in the fur rather than on top of the fur. Sometimes the raw mark that the slice tool makes can make the lines sort of sit on top of the fur. So just blending it a bit pushes it into that fur. Okay, so I think that's a good place to leave this tutorial for now. I'll be back in the next video and we'll come down onto Santa's face. But until then, thanks very much for watching and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.